Hello, world. Welcome to Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
And I'm Braden. And is water wet?
Of course it is.
Are you sure?
I'm positive.
How
Water's
so?
always wet. When have you ever
Well,
put your hand in like a bucket of water and then it's not wet?
so sorry, okay, there's wet as in the water makes you wet, so it is wet to the touch. Like you could say the same thing about a t-shirt if it's soaked, that's wet.
Yeah.
Because it makes you wet. But is the water itself wet? Like the t-shirt is wet because it is covered in water. That actually looked up the definition. Covered or
Like
um
absorbed, I guess.
yeah, like the definition of wet is covered or saturated with water or some other liquid. It can be any liquid. And so, because water is itself, can it be covered by itself and saturated with itself?
Oh, I didn't think about it that way. Ooh. Yeah, maybe that. Oh,
So, I think it really matters how you define how much water there
I'm
is.
wondering if it can even make, if water can be wet now.
Well,
Like
that's what
that's,
I'm saying.
I'm kind of backtracking now. Based on that definition, I'm thinking that once something comes in contact with water, it's wet, but water is not wet. It's like asking, is fire on fire?
Exactly. That's exactly what it's. Yeah,
It,
it's the same idea. Because I mean, if I think about it, then like if you have a 50 or 500 milliliters of water in a glass, um, people in the states will have no idea what we're talking about, maybe. Um, but if you have 500 milliliters of water in a glass and you are only looking at 250 milliliters of water, maybe that 250 milliliters is wet because it is saturated and covered by the other 250 milliliters.
it's surrounded.
Yeah.
It's like encapsulated by.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
in
but
that
I'm tempted
context,
now,
maybe.
based on the definition that you read, I'm tempted now to say water is not wet, but water makes things wet.
Yeah.
Maybe it's better to say water is moist. Everyone's favorite word.
Yeah. It's moist. Nice. Nice. Um, but I was surprised actually by the definition because it doesn't need to be water making like things aren't wet. It's any liquid.
But
Any liquid.
that's true though. Like if you, like if it doesn't, yeah, like you said, it doesn't have to be water. I'm trying to think like, I was going to say if you spill like orange juice or something, but that's still, there's still a lot of water content
Yeah. And
in
that's the
that.
tricky part. That's the tricky part.
But any liquid, you're right. Like I wouldn't, like if I dunked my hand in water, I would say, oh, my hand is soaked in water or it's wet. If
Yeah.
I dunked my hand in motor oil, I would still say my hand is soaked in oil. It's like it's all wet. Like it's still wet. It would
Yeah.
be dripping. It would, and that's a completely different substance. So I agree with that definition of wet that it doesn't have to be water. It's probably just most commonly water because that's most around relative to other types of liquids.
Yeah. Because I was originally thinking that maybe if you mixed however much water with however much of some other liquid, then maybe now the water is wet by that other liquid. But to your point, other than oils, I can't think of another liquid that isn't like 99% water.
Yeah, or isn't a liquid that's like you can like melt metal down to be a liquid. And it's like magma and
Mm,
stuff like that, but you would never,
you couldn't
it
mix
would
water with that.
probably catch things on fire. So you would never describe something as wet. It'd be on fire
Yeah, it
because the
would
temperature is
evaporate
so high, it
immediately.
would set
Yeah.
anything like if, oh, I dunked the t shirt in water
Mhm.
It's soaking wet now. Well, if you dunk a t-shirt in lava, it's not going to be soaking wet. It's just going to catch on fire immediately.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So that's the only other liquid I can think of, like you said, outside of an oil.
Yeah, I
But
can't think of anything.
it from a temperature standpoint, it's just in a different realm that it just sets everything on fire.
Yeah.
So you
And
would just
oil.
describe it as burned rather than or non-existent, as
Yeah.
opposed to being soaking wet.
Yeah. And I mean, if you mix that with water, then it would just evaporate. And like oil, you can't mix with water.
No,
You could cover oil with like water could be covered in oil. So in that sense, maybe it's wet.
yeah, like they could share the same container.
Yeah.
But if, like for example, if you make like a homemade salad dressing of some kind, right, and you're mixing in the the oil of some kind with like the juice of something else, like a lime or a lemon or something like that, you
Mm-hmm.
can see the two liquids very clearly because they don't mix together as one.
Mm-hmm.
You see the oil bubbles. So, like you said, you
Yeah.
could put water and oil together, but it's still going to be,
Mm-hmm.
they can share the same space, but they never become one.
Yeah. So in that sense, I'm wondering if maybe you could you could say in that sense that the water is wet if it's covered in the oil. Maybe. Um, do you know what vinegar is? I don't. Like
Ooh,
because I'm it's obviously it's acidic. It's some kind of an acid, but
yeah.
like lime is also acidic. Lemon is also, but it's juice, so it's water mostly.
Yeah. I would
I,
think that there's a lot of water content
I
in
imagine,
vinegar.
but I have no idea. I literally have zero idea what makes vinegar.
Neither do I, now that I'm thinking about it. But I imagine I'm guessing it's some sort of water with some sort of acid mixed together
Yeah, yeah, that's
because
probably right.
acids and waters do mix
Yeah.
in a way that oils and waters don't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. I actually, before this conversation, I never thought that like there isn't really any non water based liquids.
Because, I mean, really, probably most liquids are water based or have water content
Yeah,
to some extent.
because almost everything's water soluble. So yeah, interesting.
Right? Even like fluids in our body, like blood, has
Yeah,
a lot of
blood's
water
so
content.
much water. Yeah,
Even though if you see blood, it doesn't look like water.
even
Or, and like you said, there's all the different types of,
even
orange
even
juice, anything like that is still highly made up of water, relatively
yeah,
speaking.
even our solids, like our cells, are all water.
Yeah. So
That's
that's why I
crazy.
think you're having a hard time of thinking of a non-water based fluid or thinking of a lot of them because I don't think there's actually that many out there.
Well, fluids are interesting because air is fluid. Like gases are fluid too.
I shouldn't have said fluid. I should have said liquid.
That's okay. Well,
My
yeah,
bad.
I know what you meant, but yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I never noticed that until today. So that's interesting. Um, Speaking of oil, funny story. I think this might be pretty common actually. Um, when I was playing football, there was a guy that I played with. Um, that he was trying to gain weight, or maybe he was just trying to maintain his weight. I don't know. I don't know what he's trying to do. But at the end of the day, he would get an extra large pizza, I believe, and just not dump, but like a couple tablespoons of olive oil on the pizza to, it's just easy calories.
I
Like
was
you
gonna
don't
say
really
just for the
taste it.
calories, just to
Yeah. Yeah. Just easy calories because you don't taste the oil if it's on pizza because pizza obviously has a very overpowering taste.
yeah.
But it's extra calories.
I feel like there's already
And
a lot of oil on the pizza depending on where you get it from too.
oh, certainly, yes.
Like I feel like adding olive oil to a pizza to put more oil on it is like bringing sand to the beach. Like
Yeah.
it, I don't know if it,
Well,
like,
this is the healthy kind of oil though. Um, but it was interesting. And actually, I was listening to a podcast with, I don't remember who, it was some IFBB pro, and
Was that the bodybuilding thing?
yeah, pro
Okay.
bodybuilder. Yeah. And also a coach. He was a coach as well. And Jordan Shallow, who is the muscle doc on Instagram. If people know who that is, he's kind of big in the powerlifting education kind of world. Smart guy. But he was talking about that. One of them was talking about that as well. Like people ordering, like getting a pizza and putting olive oil on it for the calories. This would be in a off season for a bodybuilder, not a competitive season, but just when they're just trying to pack on the calories and pack on muscle, they don't really care about the body composition that much. Just hypertrophy all day, every day, as many calories. Well, not as many calories, is probably more structured than I'm letting story. Anyway, just for the sake of hypertrophy.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to be pouring olive oil on anything, but
Well, I don't think you need to be doing that. I don't think you care to do that.
no, I've already explored a diet with eating enough pizza. So I've been there, done that.
Yeah.
Don't want to go back on the pizza diet. Maybe it had something to do with the fact that the pizza came from Domino's and it's not always the best pizza, but
Domino's.
Domino's.
That's what you
Domino's for
call it.
anyone who's not sure. Makes it sound way fancier.
It does sound fancy.
You tell people you're eating 3 or 4 Domino's pizzas a week, they look at you kind of funny. But if you tell them, yeah, I'm ordering from Domino's, they may not ask. Like, I wonder if that's like a small like restaurant that serves.
Yeah.
Sounds way
run.
fancier.
It does. It does absolutely sound fancy.
There's less shame in telling people you eat 4 pizzas a week from Domino's than if you're like, yo, I crush 4 Domino's pizzas a week.
Yeah.
So that's
a good point.
I won't be doing that again.
But that actually, now that I'm thinking of it, is something we didn't like. I actually don't know if we talked about you need to be, generally speaking, in a caloric surplus to experience hypertrophy.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about it that much because I don't think we're nutrition specialists. I'm not by any means.
I'm not.
And I think it sometimes goes outside of the realm of, like, in terms of typically what we can influence as coaches. We can influence what we do in the weight room.
Mm-hmm.
You can, if you have some working knowledge of nutrition, you can guide the people you're working with. But at the end, to me, that's something that's sort of not on them entirely, but I'm not following you around for 24 hours a day to make sure you're eating enough food. Really, as a coach or as a strength coach, you can control, for the most part, what are you doing in the training session to influence hypertrophy. I think it's on the athlete, the client, the person to execute what needs to be done outside of the training piece of it.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly it's on them to execute. I would say the same thing about the weight room stuff. It's on them to execute. I do think some sort of nutrition education should be, like, if you're working with like varsity teams or something like that. A lot of them might understand what they should be doing. A lot of them are also idiots. But in some of these like podcasts and videos, people are like, if you're less experienced, you probably can experience hypertrophy, like muscular hypertrophy, without being in a caloric surplus, and like you could be losing weight and still building muscle potentially. As you're more experienced and have a like lower body fat percentage and more muscle mass, that's less likely to happen. So you will need to gain weight to build muscle, likely. And the only other thing that I guess I did want to mention this because we didn't talk about it before, was the one study that you sent to me was talking about like protein timing didn't really matter. protein source didn't really matter. It was just like 1.6 gram per kilo, I believe. Yeah, 1.6 gram per kilo body weight is like a general, like up to that point, you're seeing significant benefits. After that, you're not necessarily seeing significant benefits, um, which I think that's a pretty generally common number that people prescribe. Um, but yeah, I wanted to get that out there. And
Yeah, I think that was more just to help debunk some of the myth around like the if you don't get
the
your protein in
anabolic,
like 15 minutes after your workout, you miss that anabolic window, then
yeah,
it's like game over. Is where this was looking at, like as long as within the time frame you get enough protein into your body, because it they were showing some of the protein synthesis 24 and 48 hours later, right? Like that was
yeah,
still, that process was still happening. So whether you have that shake right after you work out or 30 minutes or an hour, you,
yeah,
you the body is still undergoing the process of developing and creating more proteins to recover. So it
yeah,
sort of helps dispel that myth of, yeah, the anabolic window
yeah.
being such
Doesn't
a
exist.
tight gap.
Yeah, it's it's not real, really.
No, it's
Um, but yeah, so that was, I mean, that was the last of the research, I guess, that I wanted to touch on. But you mentioned you had some ideas after our
man, there's
conversation.
so many ideas I've had after, like when I went back to quality control check that last episode, there was a number of things where as we were talking, and then as I went back and sifted through some of the content, I was like, there might be some different ways to do hypertrophy
Mhm.
now. Not just in the sense of like traditionally there's a block somewhere in training of hypertrophy, or if you're a bodybuilder or a WWE wrestler, you're always doing hypertrophy in some capacity. But thinking about, is there a way to do it outside of that? Like, oh, here's a time and place to do some hypertrophy, and that's the end of it.
Mhm.
And so I had some ideas around, is there ways that we have to do it differently based on some sports and athletes and different examples? And so
Mhm.
one of the first things that jumped out at me is when you had talked about the resiliency of hypertrophy, and that there were studies that showed where if you were doing eccentric based hypertrophy training, that those muscle gains and the body mass changes stayed with people over a longer period of time.
Mhm.
Then was it comparing to just concentric or both concentric and eccentric?
I think one study was just concentric, and then another study was both, and like concentric and then concentric eccentric as well.
And so my thought process around that was, okay, if there's this added resiliency, let's call it, in developing muscle mass and muscle tissue through eccentric training, is that something that's helpful in a team sport environment where you have such a long season competitively,
Mhm.
and the athletes are sometimes prone to losing muscle mass because the schedule gets skewed in favor of competition rather than training? I mean, we both primarily work in sports right now, where even in the heaviest competitive part of your season, you still train way more than you compete.
Yeah.
But we've worked with other teams where once you get in season, there's 2 or 3 games a week.
Mhm.
And so all of a sudden you go from basically training for your sport to playing 2 or 3 games a week. And then maybe you get into the weight room once.
Mhm.
And so if we now have less time to train and we're competing more, that's where you start to see some of the, athletes getting smaller, losing muscle mass throughout the season because they're not able to train as much as they were before. So I had a thought around, does some sort of eccentric based hypertrophy have a place prior to the start of the competitive season in order to develop what could be more resilient muscle tissue going into a heavy bout of competition? It's not perfect. We would probably have to, like the old school way when we had like the whiteboard sessions in Waterloo, and you spend 2 or 3 hours trying to figure stuff out. because you wouldn't want to overload a bunch of eccentric work right before the competitive season. So you'd probably have to find an intelligent way to bring it in. But is there a way to incorporate that prior to the start of the competitive season to help build resilient muscle tissue before that competitive season really just takes off and you can't train much anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really interesting idea. Because we talked about just after that little bit that right now with gyms opening and closing, that it might be something that's of interest to people because obviously it's maybe a time of forced detraining, but you can't really predict when the gyms are going to open and close within a meaningful time frame where you can, like, you're going to find out a couple weeks before the gyms close, not 6 weeks before the gyms close. But if you're preparing for a basketball season or a volleyball season or something like that, when the season starts. So that's a really interesting idea. But yeah, the tricky thing is, how do you fit it in without taking away from the other stuff? The first thing that I thought of as you were explaining that was maybe, further back in the off season, you have your hypertrophy block. Maybe you don't have one at all, but maybe you do. And maybe you're using some of this super max eccentric stuff because you care about the speed and you care about the pennation angle and things like that. But then maybe, every block subsequently, you have maybe one workout every 2 weeks where you're doing something like that, or one workout every month, maybe, where you're doing something like that. And that's your like maintenance kind of a thing.
Or you could go from the maximum, like the super max, and later on, does it need to be super max eccentric work, or could it be sub max? Could it be 80 or 90%? Then it's not as taxing.
Well, that's a good point.
Because you built up some resiliency to it. I don't know. Like
well, yeah, like I think there's a certain element like that when you build it. Obviously, it takes a significantly higher amount of like load, volume, frequency, whatever kind of amount of work to build, and it takes a lot less to maintain. And I think during the season anyway, all you really want to do is maintain. In the off season, even if you have a hypertrophy block, you want to build there and then maintain that probably while you build other things. So it would be a question, what's the minimum you need to be doing? And balancing, like I would argue if it's a higher intensity, then you can do less sets, less reps, probably less frequency as well. And maybe that's something that you can continue doing in season. If you've been doing one super max eccentric workout where you've just got like 3 exercises or whatever, that you're taking each one of them to a maximal or super maximal single eccentric, then, and you're doing that once a month, then maybe you continue that in season. You just once a month, you have that workout and you're maintaining.
You can probably find a decent window to do that in as well, whether it's an off week or reading week or.
Yeah. I mean, like there's holidays, like once a month, generally there's a long weekend. So you can schedule it the day before the long weekend, maybe. Or if you typically play 2 to 3 times a week, then you can schedule it on a two game week. You can schedule it before a weaker opponent. Or maybe if you're a terrible team, you can schedule it before a really strong opponent because you're going to lose anyway.
Throw in the towel.
But that's an interesting idea where it's maintaining the hypertrophy longer with less time, less effort. Maybe not less effort, but that's a really cool idea.
Or even if, like I said, if there's a period of time where there's just like you don't have time to train at all.
Yeah.
And well, at least if research is showing that the eccentric stuff is more resilient to tissue loss than other forms of training, then maybe you should do it instead of that. Like it's maybe a little different with the varsity environment because you can at least get them in once a week, so you can probably keep them doing something. But I was really surprised, like when I talked to some of the CFL guys, and I mean that's an 18 game season that goes over the course of like 20 or 21 weeks,
Mm.
and they'd be like, "Yeah, I think I lift like 5 or 6 times throughout the year during the
Wow.
season," because they're just like, you're so beat up, you're so tired.
Wow.
And then you're talking about a collision sport
Mm.
where having the muscle mass that's necessary is like really important
Hmm.
in order to protect your body and, be able to play with the physical style of play that, American or Canadian football is. And so some of those conversations from the past and then what we were talking about now was sort of what I thought, like, okay, if you're a collision sport or a team sport where you have a long competitive season, maybe this is something to consider if athletes are having issues keeping on muscle tissue that they had in the off season that they now no longer have during the competitive season. Maybe it's a
Mm.
solution around that.
Yeah, I mean that's cool. And I didn't know about that. That's interesting. Like talking to CFL players that they would barely lift. Like
I don't think it's all of them, but
no,
there were
I'm
some
sure
of
it's not
them
all
that,
of them.
yeah, they're
Yeah,
like, oh, whatever.
but yeah, like when I was playing at UW, like we would still lift twice a week minimum, I think. And you're gonna be banged up, so you're modifying a lot of stuff. But um, that's why I guess in my head it doesn't seem ludicrous to have people in once a month to do a super max hypertrophy. But maybe you're too exhausted for that, you know. So um, yeah, that's
Again, it would need some fine tuning for sure. This is not a
yeah.
perfect strategy, but it's something I've never considered before until we had this chat. And so it at least opens the doors to kind of say, okay, it's a concept. Could it work?
Mhm.
Let's give it some more thought and see if there's a way to incorporate it in our plan to see if it could be effective.
I'm also kind of wondering. So we talk about like if you periodize the off season, then generally you're going to go, prep, hypertrophy, strength, power, speed, because you don't need to be generally prepared for exercise right before the season. Um, After the season, you do need that. Before the season, you need to be fast. You don't need to be fast right after you finish the season, that kind of thing. So it makes sense from that perspective. But when you're in season, we want to maintain things as much as we can. But if I'm thinking about it in a speed power sport, you're going to be doing all of your speed power stuff on the court. So you might get faster through the season, aside from the fatigue and aside from, losing muscle mass. If those things didn't happen, you'd probably be getting faster, would be my guess. Maybe not, but that would be my guess. Conditioning would happen because there's no better conditioning for the sport than the sport. Um, but you'd be losing strength likely depending on the sport. You'd be building more specific strength to the sport probably, but weight room strength would decrease and hypertrophy would decrease because you're not under as much tension, you know, as often. So I'm wondering if hypertrophy is maybe the most important thing to put your efforts towards maintaining in season, which I've
Yeah.
never had that thought before.
Yeah. It's an interesting idea around that, especially like you're talking about with a team based sport, because it's like that's not a worry in an individual sport because you have so much time to train compared to
Mm-hmm.
competition that you
Mm-hmm.
can have everything lined up pretty well,
Mm-hmm.
because you're not losing a whole lot of training days. But yeah, that's an interesting concept, and the idea too that we've talked about in the previous episodes where there's not such a defined load, rep scheme, set scheme that you have to do to create hypertrophy. So if you were worried about losing strength, you could do heavier work to develop hypertrophy, or you could do, there's a lot of different ways that you could go about doing it. So Yeah, that's an interesting idea where, like you said, if there's 1 or 2 times a month, maybe there's somewhere where that needs to be in there
I
just to
suppose, like,
help keep things
yeah.
where they're at.
And if you're only focused on hypertrophy, you'd maybe be worried about getting slow. Um, you're only maintaining hypertrophy. So, like, it's not like you need to be doing a lot of slow work. And if it's this maximal eccentric, then the pennation angle doesn't change. So you're probably fine. And it would make you faster, if anything, according to the research. And you're doing so much other speed power work in practice and in the games. But I'm also kind of like, the other thing about this maximal eccentric, super maximal eccentric stuff, um, is you're, because it's so much more load than you realistically can handle, like, you're going to experience, it's a higher injury risk for sure. And it is going to be more, well, I think we alluded to, more taxing mentally and physically, neurally in general. It's going to beat up the joints faster. So that's the other consideration, I guess, using this in season or close to the season, or like for long periods of time in general. It's, you got to be careful with that.
Yeah, I'd be nervous about using the Supermax stuff in that
Mm-hmm.
context. I think the in-season idea, you'd probably have to go with a different form.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it's like we talked about in the other episodes, there's so many different ways to accomplish it
Mm-hmm.
that you can probably find a way that's a little less taxing
Mm-hmm.
on the body than using the Supermax, because I think that would be probably reserved for the off season, I think,
Mm-hmm.
because it is quite demanding. I mean, the one of the other interesting ideas I had was the paper that you had talked about that was examining some of the significance of muscle hypertrophy in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what is considered significant from the research standpoint and what's not. And that, I think, what was it, like 6 sessions or 2 weeks, you start to see
That
changes
was,
in the muscle structure, but not necessarily hypertrophy in cross-sectional area.
the one study was 6 sessions over 2 weeks reported significant type 2 hypertrophy only. So if you're only looking at type 2 fibers, then that was cross sectional. That's just one study and like a small sample size. But it was like after the first like 1 or 2 sessions, you're seeing the structural changes to like, um, yeah, like muscle repair from the damage of the novel stimulus, depending on how intense you go, and structural changes to like pennation angle and stuff. You're starting to see that stuff. I think. I think those were the structural changes, but it's regarding how, um, like how easy it is for the muscle to stand up to that specific kind of tension.
Yeah. So then the other thought I had was, does it make sense to even use a block of hypertrophy, or does it make sense to use smaller blocks throughout throughout the whole year? So if we are seeing changes, primarily we want the changes in the type 2,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the important target for most of the sports, especially
Mm-hmm.
team speed power sports. Like, that's where the focus is. And then in some cases, if these structural changes aren't making changes to the cross-sectional area, then in theory, your body composition is remaining relatively stable. So you don't have to worry from a speed power perspective of getting too large, being out of a weight class, being more cumbersome than you're used to being. So because those type 2s adapt so quickly relative to the type 1s, and because you see those structural changes so quickly, does it make sense to maybe do your 5 or 6 week strength block, and then you throw in a week or two of hypertrophy, and then you go into something else, and then a week or two of hypertrophy? Do you sprinkle it in different stages, to help keep the tissue where it needs to be throughout the year, but then you don't have this, like, the traditional downside of this long block of hypertrophy, spending more time on the quality than you need, and then you're doing a lot of like slower, fatiguing work, would it maybe make sense just to sprinkle it in there here and there, and you still get the changes maybe that you're looking for without some of the drawbacks of doing that work for an extended period of time.
It'd be very interesting to experiment with that. I think that's a really cool idea.
I'm going to try it. I've
Cool.
decided, I wrote some stuff. I'm going to try it for myself.
All right. Definitely report back and let us know how that goes.
I don't know how well we're going to learn from it, but I'm going to try it.
Yeah.
Just to see.
No, I think that's a really cool idea. That reminds me of something that Mike Teixeira does with the reactive training systems that I talked about a few times in the early episodes, where if every athlete, powerlifting specifically anyway, has a time to peak, a number of sessions or a number of microcycles until you reach a peak training status, you need to line that up with competition. So at some point, you're going to probably have to shorten a block or lengthen a block or lengthen the deload or pivot between blocks, something like that. Something that he has done to bridge the gap sometimes is to do, like, if an athlete peaks in 6 weeks, maybe, and they're a little bit off schedule, then adding in like 2 weeks of hypertrophy or something like that.
And then starting the 6-week block so that they end that peak at competition.
Yeah. So they would, maybe the competition's not 100% set. You're in the middle of a 6-week block. So you finish that 6-week block, when the competition is now, okay, we're going to be a couple weeks early. So 2 weeks of hypertrophy, pivot, 6-week block, compete. And with some athletes, not everybody, but with some athletes that maybe respond better to hypertrophy based training, he's noticed the subsequent block is better than expected because of that short block he assumes because of that short hypertrophy block. So in my world, there is some precedent there at least. And I think that's very interesting. Yeah. I mean, if you can get a meaningful stimulus, it's not like a crazy stimulus, but it's meaningful. I don't know that the cumulative, if you're doing, 8 total weeks of hypertrophy, whether it's an 8-week block, 2 4-week blocks, or 4 2-week blocks, if those would all equal the same amount, I think likely not.
I don't think it would either.
But you're also not, having any adverse effects probably in 2 weeks. You can do other things while you're doing your hypertrophy. It's maybe that functions as your deload or something like that.
My thought, sorry too, I should have said this, is that this is obviously not for like, a 15 or 16-year-old kid that might need to spend a longer period of time in hypertrophy to actually put on the size. But is this beneficial for athletes with a higher training age where you're in the wheelhouse of the amount of muscle tissue and size and things like that that you want? Is does sprinkling it in smaller bouts make more sense rather than having a dedicated block to it or just not doing it at all? So yeah, that was an idea that I had around those, the ideas that you presented, that the type 2 fibers will hypertrophy quicker, and in this case, a relatively short period of time, potentially. And then the structural changes in the muscle that won't even change the cross-sectional area, but can make the muscle stronger, happens even faster.
Mm-hmm.
So is it worth at least playing around with to see if those small bouts are more effective than, like I said, just grinding away for 8 weeks and being slow and being tired the whole time?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea. I definitely. What are you going to measure that stuff?
I don't really have a way to measure it right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like when I did that ridiculous Bonderchuck experiment,
Yeah.
I had access, like I was in the weight room, I was on the track. So I had laser timing. I had
Hmm.
the push band to figure out velocities, and I had a jump mat to figure out jump height and all those types of things. Um, I don't have access to any of that stuff right now. I was just thinking more so like from like how bad is that week or two of hypertrophy fatigue going to be in between stuff? That's more what I was curious to play around with. Like, is it too fatiguing a stimulus to use in those variation weeks? So that's more what I wanted to feel from it, was like, do you come out of a strength block and you're kind of tired? And then if you do this hypertrophy stuff in between, does it just completely tank you? And then trying to come up out of it into the next phase, is it even doable? That's kind of what I wanted to play around with.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it would be interesting to see. In my head, I think you could easily program like 3 days a week. Maybe you have 3 movements that you care about, and you're doing, maximal or super maximal eccentric, and you have that workout. You're doing 3 days a week, that exact same workout.
Exactly. So you
Two, yeah,
get
2 weeks
comfortable
in a
with it.
row. Yeah, and then that's all you need, because you just like you have 6 sessions of doing the same movements, so you're getting that meaningful response from each of those exercises. And I mean, that's only 2 weeks, so you could theoretically take like another week of very light training and then come back into it.
Yeah.
Um, that's maybe longer than you want to spend. I don't know.
Well, you could even make that first week too of whatever block that you were reintroducing of training,
Mm-hmm,
not as voluminous, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's ways around it. So I'm just curious to try
Yeah.
the smaller chunks of hypertrophy and
Mm-hmm.
see what happens. Just the
Yeah.
thought that I had, that I'd never thought about breaking it up into smaller chunks until we had that
Mm-hmm.
discussion about the
Yeah.
stuff.
No, it's a cool idea. It's a cool idea, because I think that way you're practicing the other skills more often as well. Like the strength and speed and power skills, you're doing those things more often. So I would think you'd find like more progress and higher permanence with those things. Um,
Yeah, and
so
theoretically, that was my thought process on
mhm.
that.
and
So
and then even going back to like the first idea you had, if you're used to doing, you know, smaller bouts of hypertrophy infrequently or like more frequently, then maybe it's easier to jump into doing
over
one or
time.
two hypertrophy workouts a month kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
So yeah, and then you had just talked there about some of the Supramax stuff, which is interesting because if you look at the research, right,
Mm.
it's all like laboratory based,
Yeah.
and you're
Yeah.
in machines, and it's so like the concept of that Supermax eccentric work to build muscle and length and add sarcomeres and etc. on paper looks really good, but like, is it feasible to actually do in a weight room without tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment
Well,
that they
yeah, like
use in these studies?
yeah, and I was reading these studies, like they were saying concentric only, eccentric only, and I'm like, there was only one study that said specifically the lab technician or assistant or whatever returned whatever machine to the starting location, so there was 0 eccentric or concentric for whatever group. Um, but otherwise, I'm like, how are you going to do that? Because you can't, even if it's like a machine or a cable or whatever, you can't just get to the top of the movement and let go.
Could you imagine
Yeah.
being that person in the gym that you just like pull the cable down and you just let it go and the weight stack just thunders throughout the weight
Yeah,
room?
you can't just keep, you can't, and if you're doing eccentric only, you can't get it to the top
Yeah.
without getting it to the top.
Yeah. How do I
Um,
lower an object down that isn't already picked up?
exactly. So like it doesn't, logically, it doesn't work. So when I'm thinking about it, the only way it makes sense, well, what you did with your hypertrophy, the type 2 eccentric hypertrophy training, was working up to a supermax single. So the warm up sets, you can go down and up, and that's fine. Um, but the top set, you can't lift it because it's supermax. So then you set it down on the safeties, and then you have to unload the bar, lift it back up. And because you're doing split squats, you have to do both sides. So you have to lift it up, load it back up, and then do the other side. But in my head, like, that's just not feasible. And I mean, you can speak to that much more than I can because you're the one who did it.
Yeah. I mean, it's feasible to do, but there's some tedious
Yeah,
tasks in
like
it,
it's
right? Like you mentioned, you have to put up, a bunch of plates on the bar. And if you're squatting, for instance, you then lower yourself down to the safeties and done. So you did your 10-second eccentric with 100+%. But now you're sitting with the bar on the safeties and you have to unload a few plates on each side, move the bar back up into the rack, and then put all the weight back on. And you could do the same thing with like a deadlift or an RDL, right down to the safeties. But then same idea, you have to shed enough weight off the bar after that one rep to then put it back up. So I mean, it's doable, especially too if you're on your own, where like you don't need a spot for that because you can be inside the safety rack. You're going to drop it on the pins, or not drop it, but set it down on the pins. So it's not like you need a number of spotters to help you move the weight back up. I mean, if you had it, maybe a couple of people just help move the bar back up rather than you having to unload weight. But the way that I did it, because I was on my own, was a little bit tedious because I had to strip weight and add it back on every time to get the heavy load to the starting position so that I could then only do the lowering part of the movement. So it's doable, but it's tedious.
Well, and
As a warning.
that's the thing. And like, so with that in mind, you're going to be hard pressed to program, any meaningful, like you're probably not going to program more than 2 or 3 sets of that in one workout. Like you might only want to program one because
I was doing 4 singles in that program.
and so and it sucked.
It was tedious. Like, and you had to basically go in and go, okay, I was going to do it with an RDL. I was going to go in and do it with a squat. And I think I did it with pull-ups as well, which wasn't too bad because I built a ladder to just climb
I
up
do
with the
remember
weight.
that. I do remember that. So that's not so bad. But so depending on the exercise, it's easier or worse. But anyway, so it's important, I think, to consider buy-in with that kind of programming, because if you have and as a coach, you're going to know that, yes, absolutely, some people are all in. I was watching a video, some NFL analyst talking about stuff, and some NFL player was like, maybe 3% of the teammates they'd ever had were 100% in. So those players will do it, but not everyone's going to be doing it. Like, a good chunk of the players that you have, depending on the sport, don't want to be in the weight room at all. So
And this is probably more feasible with an individual too. Doing this stuff with a team would be a disaster.
Yeah. So it's important to consider that, considering the exercise. Some exercises are going to be easier or harder. And for me in my sport, I care a lot about the neural adaptations, the motor pattern, to the point where I might not want to be going the supermax, even if it's only the eccentric, because people are going to compensate in ways that they're not used to on the way down.
Especially for movements in the weight room that are your sport.
Exactly. So
it's different where the movement's a means to an end.
Yeah. For sport athletes, that's probably fine. But for me, I don't want that. So in my head, the best way to get supermax eccentric for more volume, especially without the potential motor pattern interference, is with machines, and doing like a quad extension maximal. It's super max for one leg, and you lower it with one leg and then lift it with two, and then you can lower it with the other leg, lift it with
the
two.
2 up, 1 down.
Yeah, exactly. And you could do that with like any machine row, with not any machine row. It would, you don't want it to like turn or whatever. But chest supported rows, you could do that. Pec flies or pec decks, you could do that. Hamstring curls, you could do that. Even like a hack squat or a leg press, you could do that. So in my head, that seems a lot more feasible.
Yeah,
From a
definitely is.
programming
If you have those
standpoint.
machines available, then you can, like you said, the 2 up, 1 down. I've done that as well, and it works. Um, you can do it with some other exercises too. I've done it with hip thrusters,
Yeah.
where you use both legs to bring it up, and then once the
Mhm.
bar is bridged, you lift the 1 foot off the ground, just lower it down
Mhm.
with the one. Um, you can do it with push-ups too. Lower yourself down with one arm and use both to bring you back up. And I think you still have the concentric action in there, but it's so little
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
you
It's like
probably don't have to worry about it,
not
like
meaningful.
interfering with whatever it was that you're
Mhm.
trying. So yeah, definitely the 2 up, 1 down method with the machines or different exercises that kind of suit it better, I think is a viable solution
Mhm.
as well, to play around with that really slow, heavy eccentric loading that's heavier than you can move.
Mhm. Yeah. So those were the only like concerns that I had, other than like injury concerns and like motivation, buy-in. Those are things to think about. You're going to have that with any program, and I mean, at some point, you're going to have to do something that's hard. So whether that's this or something else, the people who don't really want to be in the weight room are going to complain about it. So maybe it doesn't matter that much. But I think doing compound movements with this makes a lot more sense with team sport athletes or individual sport athletes. Just not. I wouldn't do it with a squat, bench, or deadlift with a power lifter.
No, and that makes complete sense. And
Yeah,
I agree with you. You'd probably be better off just to use, like you said, the quad extension of the hamstring curl machine,
yeah,
like even in the accessory afterwards,
yeah.
just
Exactly.
bang out a few of those on the
Yeah.
machine.
hmm And that's nice because it's not so taxing, and you can do that multiple times a week, and you can hit your 6 sessions or your 18 sessions or whatever, um, in a reasonable amount of time. So yeah, that's something that I'm going to be playing around with some of my athletes, I think.
Yeah. And it's
Um,
such a unique training stimulus too that, I mean, for most athletes, they're probably never going to do this type of training.
yeah.
This is for, probably someone who is getting close to the ceiling,
hmm
needs something with a very high level of variation or difference
hmm
to what they've normally done to help them kind of get that last little bit out of their training.
hmm
So I think that's the other thing to consider too, is that probably 95% of the athletes you work with, this isn't even a consideration.
Yeah.
It's a very down the road thought,
Yep.
in my
Yep.
mind anyway.
Yeah. Certainly. Um, yeah, because I mean, as we say, like it's not like you need to do a specific thing to do hypertrophy. You're gonna do it. Just this might augment it. So if you need it to be augmented to experience it at all, then just consider this anyway. One other thing that I wanted to ask you about, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this at all, was relatively specific hypertrophy. Um, I think it's easier in a like a hinge joint kind of thing, like targeting the hamstrings, targeting the quads, targeting biceps, or elbow flexors, knee extensors, that kind of thing. Like if you do it with a neutral grip, you're probably going to get some um, biceps and I think is brachialis the one under it. I can't remember. Whatever the other elbow flexor
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
If you do it with
Or brachioradialis. I don't know which one.
that's one of the forearm. That's one of the forearm ones, but it also
Yeah.
flexes the elbow.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't have an anatomy book on me
yeah.
present.
But anyway, so like you're not gonna, depending on the grip, you can do more or less of one or the other. Um, the specific instance that matters for me is hip extension, glutes versus hamstrings. Um, I see it a lot that the hamstrings are a more dominant hip extensor in a lot of my powerlifters, which is something that I don't want, because hamstrings are also going to flex the knee, which is going to resist the quad action. And if you're using a lot of hamstrings, you're also not using a lot of glutes, which is going to expose you to more low back injury risk, which is not good in a sport that's loading the low back all the time. So, from that perspective, and I had a conversation with a guy that I used to work for, who trains hockey players, and he was wondering about specifically like I think he called it like the lateral glute shelf, something like that. The area of your glutes that's going to be producing a lot of lateral force in agility based sports like glute med and those sorts of muscles in that area. Yeah, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about getting more specific with where you're doing the hypertrophy.
I think was it the last episode or the one before, where we had talked about some of the like areas of the body that was selectively hypertrophied without any intent. Right when I talked about running, then all of a sudden there were some changes in hip flexor and
Right.
like calves and gastroc and things like that. And then you talked about squatting in like barefoot or socks or whatever, as opposed to in a lift, which then you noticed more gastroc and soleus development. So as far as specific hypertrophy goes, like with any of the athletes I work with, I think the repetition of the training they do in the sport will take care of that. Right. And whether that's, like in basketball, having maybe one arm slightly larger than the other, because that's your shooting arm, or one leg being slightly larger than the other, if that's your plant leg or your kicking leg or something like that. So I think there's a level of hypertrophy that you just let happen, like you said, because the body's adapting to everything all the time. And so with team sport athletes, and even now, like I work with individual sport athletes, to me, the hypertrophy is going to come from the compound movements, because then you're hitting, call it everything globally. And then the specific work that we do on the track or in the sport or whatever, that's going to help create any additional hypertrophy that's needed based on the demands we're placing on that individual. And obviously everyone responds to stuff a little bit differently. Some people get really big after they squat. Some people don't. Some people can develop the anterior chain really well. Some people develop the posterior chain really well. So you may have to target some things specifically to balance or things like that. But I haven't really thought much about specific hypertrophy for any of the athletes I work with, meaning like nitty gritty with like, oh, this muscle or that muscle. Because it's still more, I think, global.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't, with sprinters, I wouldn't really think it matters. I mean, you guys are all going in a straight line for the most part anyway.
The occasional left-hand turn.
Yeah, with some left-hand turns.
It's like NASCAR.
So maybe in like volleyball or basketball, it matters a little bit more. Maybe in football, it matters a little bit more than that. It matters a lot more in powerlifting, in my experience anyway. But I think that's a good point that, yeah, for the most part, the sport's probably going to take care of what they need to hypertrophy.
It's probably from an injury standpoint that this becomes relevant, right? Where if someone has an injury, then you might need to hypertrophy a specific area, right? Like quad, for example, prior to going in for an ACL surgery.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
So often, anytime I should have added that, anytime I've done specific hypertrophy with an athlete, it's usually based around an injury, right? Where something is overdeveloped and then something is underdeveloped, and you have to help bring balance there, or, someone's going in for surgery on a particular part of the body and certain muscles are going to be exposed to shrinking because they're not being used as much. So let's build up that muscle. That's really the only time I've used something in that regard.
That's actually another time when you might want to use maximal eccentric training, super max eccentric training, to get some more resilient hypertrophy. Um,
Another idea.
but yeah, I'm the only times like in powerlifting I want to often target the glutes without targeting the hamstrings, which is tricky to do. Um, and lately I've just been starting very, very light, and like you need to do these things to make sure you're working the glutes, like mostly the glutes and not the hamstrings. And then once you refine that pattern, then you can use the glutes more so, and it becomes hypertrophy later. But right now it's just activation and like motor programming basically. Um, outside of that, like isolation movements are really easy, like for the quads or for the biceps or whatever. Um, and yeah, for beginners and for people that don't need a lot of hypertrophy, I think compound movements are amazing. Um, some bodybuilders I hear talking about, like once you get to a higher training age or a higher, like when it becomes harder for you to put on mass, then you're going to need to target certain areas and maintain other areas to actually make meaningful progress. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think just spending more time doing it or trying things that you haven't tried before for that area will probably get the job done. Um, yeah, that was it. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about hypertrophy wise?
No, that those were kind of the big thoughts that I had. Just to, like I said, a few of those ideas in terms of how do we rethink maybe some other ways to do hypertrophy that break tradition, let's say, and then obviously the difficulty of or the feasibility challenge of implementing some of that really heavy eccentric training. But that's we covered quite a bit of that today.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah,
hopefully
those were.
people have a starting point, maybe some new ideas, or if they wanted to try that stuff, an idea of how to do it.
Yeah, yeah, that was. I mean, yeah, that was some really interesting ideas, I think, to play around with. Um, you mentioned before this that you were playing around with some interesting music selection, some new ideas, some things you weren't expecting to see.
Well, I checked out the "We Will Rock You" cover that you told me to by In This Moment,
Were you excited about that? Were you impressed by it, or did it?
and that's where this is where the interesting part came in. So you told me it was In This Moment that did the cover, but I didn't realize that there were other artists featured in the song as well.
I also didn't realize that.
So In This Moment is the band,
Okay.
but then they also it was featuring Maria Brink, who is the lead vocalist from In This Moment.
Mm-hmm.
There was also Taylor Momsen, who is the lead vocalist from The Pretty Reckless. I don't listen to The Pretty Reckless.
I like
Um,
some of their stuff.
I I wasn't sure if they're relatively well known,
Mm-hmm.
so they've done all right for themselves. So they are she's featured in that song, and then Lizzie Hale from Hailstorm,
Love Hailstorm.
and dude, she's good. Like
Mm,
we're talking
yeah.
about a very very talented vocalist. So when I was suspect about how the song was going to go because it doesn't suit In This Moment's style. Like she's got such a like a harsh and aggressive voice that works really well for their style of music. I wasn't sure if she could kind of pull off that song. They did a pretty good job, I thought. Like it was a
Yeah.
decent cover.
I liked it. They played around with the sound of it for sure. Like
Yeah.
it's not like a one for one. It's definitely in their style.
But when I saw that Lizzie Hale was featured on this track, I was like, dude, this is gonna be sick. Like she's gonna kill it. And she did.
Mhm.
Like she was unreal. And then I was like, man, I gotta start listening to some more Hailstorm. So then I
Nice.
went on a Hailstorm kick
Yeah.
and listened to a bunch of stuff by them because like they're kind of like hard rock and roll. Like they have a little bit of like a old school rock and roll
Mm.
feel to them with some of their stuff. And like they're awesome. And so yeah, I was stoked when I saw that Lizzie Hale was featured on that song. So I was like, man, she's gonna kill it. It's gonna be good. And it was. And then it led me down the Hailstorm path to go listen to some more of the stuff that I hadn't listened to in so long.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Hailstorm was some of those songs were on the original like Octane
Oh yeah,
pack
they were
playlist.
very well featured on that.
Yeah, and yeah, those were some of that stuff's really good. Like that's some of my, I guess, yeah, hard rock edging towards metal ish.
Yeah,
Some of my like my favorite songs in that genre are by them for sure. Very
and they
very
have a
good
bunch of
stuff.
cover albums too.
Oh really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so they released like an original album, and then I think they have Reanimate 1, 2, and maybe even a 3, and it's
Oh
song all
man.
covered. And they do a wide range of stuff. They have
Oh
like old school, like Bay Area thrash Metallica. They have like AC/DC. They cover some
okay
stuff. They have a cover of Daft Punk.
okay.
Um, what's the song? Is it Heathens by 21 Pilots?
Oh, that's nice.
Is that a song?
I
Did
think
I
so.
get that correct? I don't know.
I'm not a
Um,
21 Pilots guy, but I think you're in the ballpark.
okay, they have like covered by them. So there's a lot of stuff you can listen to by them. Like I'd say there's probably something for everybody. And
Yeah,
she
that
just proves she can sing any song. Like just it good stuff. So yeah, I had a lot of fun. That one song you told me to listen to just cascaded into a whole musical adventure over the
well,
past week.
I'm glad you liked it. That might have to be where I am for the next week, honestly. That
The covers album?
those covers albums, yeah. I mean their originals are amazing too.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I was in a little bit of a similar vein. I was in the gym this morning for the first time in a few months. Well, training myself for the first time in a few months in the gym, um, which was very nice. And I was listening to Evanescence
Oh,
um,
yeah,
on
that's a
Spotify,
yes.
and because it was on Spotify, it wasn't all of their hits. It was just some, whatever Spotify was showing me, and it was nice. I, she's got an amazing voice and can pull off a wide range of feels in a song, which is
I sort
cool.
of forgot about them, but there's some good
Yeah,
stuff.
they're good, man. Um, and and then I got into towards the end of the workout a little bit of Breaking Benjamin, which I don't think they are as widely popular, but I like some of their stuff and I like their sound.
I've heard of them. I don't know if I've ever actually
Oh, really?
heard. I probably heard something by them because I'm sure I think they've been on, like they've had stuff featured on
Yeah.
Octane Radio,
There's two songs that I feel like every single person has heard.
but
Um,
there's nothing that jumps out to me where I'm like, oh yeah, Breaking Benjamin, sick band.
you
Or
need to hear
I
it.
don't really listen to them at all.
You need to hear it. I'll send you a couple links. I think not that you need to hear them, just like these are the songs that you know by them. I'm sure.
Well, and then I might be like, oh no, I have heard this song.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, but yeah, a good musical week and really good conversation
Yeah.
about
Well, you'll have to
hypertrophy.
report back what your favorite. I already know what my favorite cover song by Hailstorm is.
Okay,
So you can report back next week, and then we can
all
see
right.
if
Yeah, don't spoil it. Maybe it's
yeah,
the same.
see which one it is. Yeah, that's why I
Yeah,
didn't want to tell you.
yeah.
I
All
don't
right.
want to jade your view or bias your view
Yeah.
going
Okay.
into it where you now have higher expectations for that particular song relative to the
Mm,
other ones.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, you'll
All
have to
right.
report back for the next episode.
Will do. Will do. Um, yeah. And if anybody wants us to talk about anything in particular on the next episode or any episode, hit us up on Instagram, Speed Strength Show, Speed Strength Performance, Braden Southern. And yeah, questions, comments, whatever. Um, that is probably the last hypertrophy video
I
podcast for a
think so.
while.
Yeah, we spent 3 episodes on it, so
Yeah,
that's enough for now.
it's thorough. Yeah. Um, but yeah, that was the Speed Strength Show. Thanks for coming along, world.
We'll see you next time.
Peace.